So, the European Union has just made a seismic shift towards Russia over the war in Ukraine, whilst Ukraine itself has signalled something as extraordinary. Zelensky has now said he's prepared to give up NATO membership, the very red line Russia has claimed this war was always about, in exchange for hard securities from the United States and Europe. As well, the European Union has now officially frozen 210 billion euros in Russian sovereign assets, giving Brussels real financial and political leverage for the first time since the invasion 3 years ago. And all of this is happening as Washington pushes Kiev towards this peace deal by Christmas, one that many Ukrainians and Europeans see as dangerously close to capitulation. So the question is no longer just how this war ends, but who shapes the peace, and whether Europe is finally prepared to act like a serious actor. With that in mind, in this video, I wanted to explain these revelations from Ukraine, the significant shift in Europe, the timing of both, and how it could play into the decision-making of not only the Kremlin or Brussels, but of course, the United States and Trump. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you're new here, we focus on the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, with a particular emphasis on the war in Ukraine. Now, if you've been following it very closely, you'll know that the peace talks have been coming and going, and the fanfare-dom around supposedly something happening, when actually, of course, not much is. And in some ways, this moment might not be different. But to me, I think it is a little bit, because of the actual substantive change, the policy decision by the European Union to obtain and freeze and potentially utilize, leverage these assets of Russia in the broader war and direction of trying to force Moscow to make concessions. Now, you may disagree with that, but it's important to consider. So, well, I want to hear what you guys have to say. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts. Now, of course, this is incredibly time sensitive. Ukraine is exhausted but defiant. Russia is advancing slowly but bleeding strategically. The United States wants this war wrapped up fast, especially in my mind, given in his targeting Europe most of all, who is finally realizing, hopefully, that whatever happens next will define its own security, not for the next couple of years, but for the decades. The Pax Americana period, as many have seen it, is, and as Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, has said in just recent days, over, at least for Europe's perspective and Europe's interest. But before getting into Europe's move, let's talk about Zelensky's. You see, over the weekend, he has confirmed that Ukraine would be willing to abandon its demand for NATO membership, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, that is huge. NATO membership has been one of Ukraine's long-term strategic goals for over a decade. Giving it up is not a symbolic gesture. It's a serious concession aimed at unblocking these negotiations and, if anything, trying to appease Trump and demonstrate that Ukraine is genuine about seeking peace, even though it's Putin who's the one who doesn't want to. Zelensky has been clear about this trade-off, though. No NATO does not mean no protection. What Kiev is asking for instead are Article 5-style security guarantees, bilateral commitments from the United States, from Europe, and key partners like Canada, Japan, who would guarantee military support if Ukraine is attacked again, i.e., if NATO membership is politically impossible, then deterrence, though, still has to be real. And Zelensky has framed this explicitly as a compromise, but it's not a surrender. He's trying to be the bigger person here, and he has also pushed back hard against one of the more controversial US ideas, this creation of a so-called free economic or demilitarized zone in eastern Ukraine. This proposal would require Ukrainian forces to withdraw from heavily fortified cities they've defended for over a decade, the fortress belt, while offering no clear guarantee that Russia would pull back equally. And so Zelensky has been blunt, and understandably and rightly so. If Ukraine pulls back 5 or 10 kilometers, why damn well won't the Russians do the same in sovereign Ukrainian territory? And if there's no symmetry, there's no enforcement, no guarantees, and so there isn't peace. It's exposure and a continuation. For Kiev, the only viable option is simple. The sides stop where they stand and everything else is resolved diplomatically. That's a ceasefire, not a territorial concession, as the United States' current peace proposals make it look. Now, contrast that with, of course, Moscow's position. Putin's response via his foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov, has been essentially no. No to NATO, no to Crimea ever returning, no to demilitarized zones, no to freezing the front lines. It's these maximalist demands they've said since the very beginning. Ushakov stated that Russia would only accept full control over the Donbass and dismiss Ukrainian and European proposals as unconstructive. But as we'll see a little bit later on, the Russians are not very happy about the Europeans. And so, despite them dismissing the Europeans as irrelevant, actually, look at what they're doing versus what they're saying, they're pretty rattled. Ushakov also said that they ruled out a so-called Korean scenario, a frozen conflict with a heavily defended line of separation. And so that tells us something else crucial. Russia isn't negotiating for peace, not that it shouldn't be obvious at this point. It's negotiating for ratification of conquest, if you like. And that's why these talks are so fragile. Because even as Ukraine compromises, the Kremlin's demands remain unchanged, maximalist, territorial, and inherently imperial in nature. And this brings us to Europe in a couple of ways. Now, as most of you know, I'm heavily critical of Europe, not because I'm against it, but because I want the best for the continent. For much of this war, Europe has funded Ukraine, but watched negotiations from the sidelines and always been saying the right thing, but never really following through. That's now changing. Last week, the EU didn't just freeze the Russian assets again, it's locked them in. In a genuinely audacious move, the European Union has decided to indefinitely mobilize around 210 billion euros, $300 billion, in Russian sovereign assets, most of them belonging to the Russian central bank, removing them from the usual 6-month sanctions renewal cycle that they had become used to and also dangerously fragile to failing. And so this matters far more than it sounds, because until now, these assets were frozen under the standard sanctions regime, which requires unanimous renewal every 6 months. That means the Hungaries, the Slovakias can impede it. And it had turned into this geopolitical liability. We did it twice, threatening to veto them, and the whole sanctions program collapsing. In other words, though, this 210 billion, Europe's single biggest source of leverage over Moscow, was effectively being held hostage to the whims of one or two capitals. And so Brussels, along with many other nation states, decided this was no longer acceptable. So instead of relying on sanctions law, the Commission triggered a very clever emergency clause on the EU treaties. Article 122, normally reserved for economic crises like COVID or the energy shock of 2022, the legal logic being quite ingenious in some eyes. The Commission has argued that Russia's war has created a serious and ongoing economic emergency for Europe. Higher uncertainty, disrupted supply chains, suppressed investment, rising risk, and a constant backdrop of hybrid attacks from sabotage and cyber operations to drone incursions and disinformation campaigns. That justification, therefore, has allowed the EU to bypass this unanimity, bypass the EU Parliament, and act with qualified majority voting, with the result being quite extraordinary. Member states are now legally prohibited from returning assets to Russia. This 210 billion will only be released if Russia ends the war, agrees to pay forms of reparations to Ukraine, which it has flatly refused in any regard, and no longer threatens the European economy. It seems like Putin's own provocations have absolutely backfired on him. In practice, this means it sets the bar so high that the assets are effectively immobilized. For all intents and purposes, the money is gone, insulated from the Kremlin's war machine, and transformed into a long-term leverage for Europe. The EU commissioner, or head of the EU, if you like, von der Leyen, put it bluntly, that as long as Russia's war continues, Putin's costs will continue to rise. This wasn't just a message to Moscow, it was also a signal to Washington. The decision directly blocks what was a leaked US-Russian peace proposal and would have split the assets into an effective investment vehicle for commercial gain, a dramatic reversal of the accountability principle Europe has insisted on since 2022. Europe has drawn a line, not just, of course, against Putin and the Kremlin, but also about the decisions Europe has towards America, that European-held assets will be made in Europe, and Europe is no longer willing to let European powers bargain away its leverage behind closed doors for the supposed great powers to dictate to little Europe how it works. But the EU is a big entity that can stand up for itself, but not necessarily through hard power, but through soft and economic means. And that is why the Kremlin has reacted with fury. It's filed a lawsuit against Euroclear in Brussels. And many European diplomats are quietly celebrating this move, because if the Russians are trying to go to court, not exactly like the Kremlin likes to act in lawful ways, it shows that they are rattled, they are out of options, they don't really know what to do. For the first time, the EU has demonstrated what it looks like when it uses its comparative advantage as a geopolitical power: law, markets, currency jurisdiction, and scale. Europe may not yet be a military superpower, but it is a regulatory and financial giant. And this move showed that when pushed, it knows how to weaponize that fact. It's just been a damn well too long time coming. And it's offered a glimpse of what European foreign policy, more strategically autonomous, not just of the United States, but globally, could act. Less symbolism, less hostage staking, less outrage, but more action and defiance. And crucially, it means Europe is no longer just funding Ukraine. It's shaping the peace, not just for Ukraine, but also its longer term interests. Now, within all of this, of course, Washington is pushing hard and reacting to this seismic decision by the European Union. Donald Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are pressing Kiev to accept this deal by Christmas, largely on terms first discussed between Washington and Moscow. And that's the uncomfortable reality, that Europe and Ukraine are now scrambling to rewrite this plan that they didn't draft and before it's finalized without them. And so Zelensky's surprise visit to the frontline town of Kupiansk has mattered as well, demonstrating that Russia's claims that the city was already captured is nonsense and that the war is still firmly on, but dependent upon the willingness of the Europeans and perhaps the Americans to support Ukraine. Ukrainian forces are pushing back, and Zelensky has said that military resilience strengthens diplomatic leverage. But of course, within all of this, there is the time factor. Europe's moves are a good step, but they need to be faster and more efficient. Russian forces do advance elsewhere, and the pressure on Ukraine's manpower is growing. And in all of this, of course, I want to reiterate the core issue at heart. Even if Ukraine never joins NATO, Europe cannot outsource its security any longer. Merz has put it starkly that comparing Putin's war is like Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938. It's not as rhetoric, it's a warning that the similarities between the behavior of the Kremlin and what happened 75, 80 years ago. Back then, concessions didn't buy peace, they bought appetite. And Europe understands this instinctively because the consequences of weakness never stay neatly contained. If Ukraine falls or is forced into some hollow peace, the costs will not stop at its borders. We have to consider the reality of what is possible for Ukraine in the short to medium term of taking back territory. But equally, we must not sit down and allow people like Putin to get away with what they're doing. This is where the conversation is uncomfortable, because Ukraine is not the only area where Europe is quietly recalibrating its assumptions. Across the continent, governments are taking tougher, more realist positions on security adjacent issues that were once treated as untouchable. For years, the EU has been quite soft on, say, irregular migration, but the fact that they are beginning to talk about taking more assertive steps towards it, as well as, say, revising the European Convention on Human Rights to change the laws around irregular migrants and classifications, is a stepping stone and an illustration of how they can approach this in a similar way when it comes to Putin or other areas of potential international security and the war in Ukraine specifically. So the EU must do more than issue statements. Firstly, it must lock in credible enforcement security guarantees for Ukraine, with or without NATO, that go beyond vague assurances. Second, it must accelerate its own real military capacity. Ammunition stockpiles, air defense, command integration and industrial scale, not just pledges. And thirdly, it must use economic and diplomatic power unapologetically. That means frozen Russian assets are not just a leverage, they are a precedent. Because peace without deterrence, it's not peace, it's a pause. So Zelensky has shown flexibility, Europe is showing that resolve, Russia is showing, well, basically none, and it tells us as much as we need. That the outcome of these talks won't just determine Ukraine's borders, it will determine Europe's relevance as a geopolitical actor or a spectator to decisions made everywhere else. And because if Europe cannot defend Ukraine after everything it has learned, then the problem will never be about NATO. It will be always about Europe's complacency and hesitation. But if anything illustrates that it's changing, then, well, 2026 hopefully will be much more positive. But that's it from me. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about this. And as always, do consider liking the video and subscribing if you want to know when I release more future videos like this and coming up into the new year. And if you want to support me further via a coffee or becoming a member on YouTube, then you can find the links in the description. See you all.